Welcome to Potentiality, a space for big questions, deep conversations, and share wisdom around the most meaningful thing we do as human beings, which is how we parent and educate the next generation. Our today's guest is Avishta Seeras, a social impact designer, a language rights advocate whose work sits at the intersection of language justice, cultural bridge building, and human resilience. As co-founder of African Languages Conference and director of cultural design at Cultura Connector, she builds programs that empower Indigenous, Creole, and underrepresented communities to preserve what they carry, their language, their traditions, and the living architecture of who they are. She has collaborated with the UNESCO Secretariat for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages and developed trauma-informed initiatives that use cultural storytelling and transformative design to support healing among communities navigating conflict, displacement, and adversity. At the heart of everything Avishta does is a single conviction: language rights are human rights. Welcome to Potentiality, Avishta.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Lena. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I really look forward to having this conversation about language rights as human rights, and hopefully can share some of my experiences with your listeners.
Thank you so much for making the time to share the space with me. As multilingual people, we are super passionate about language rights, and I really wanted your wisdom and your voice in this space. So I would like us to start by unpacking what it really means, language rights as human rights. What does it mean to you, not only academically and professionally, and I know you have a wealth of experience in this, but what does it mean to you personally? And how did you come to do the work that you do?
Sure. Well, when I say language rights are human rights, what I really mean by that is uh, anyone should have access to essential services, like access to education, to legal services, to healthcare, in their language. If we find ourselves in a situation where that's not the case, that basically just means that it's only written on paper, where people can have those access, and it's not in real life. So this is why this framing of language rights or human rights is because all these other systems that I just mentioned, education, healthcare, and democratic or political participation and legal representation, they're all considered to be um, major human rights.
Mhm.
So why not think of language as well as a basic human right? Because to have access to all of these services, we actually need at the core of it, at the center of it, is language. So this is what we mean by language rights or human rights. And I started learning about this field not that long ago, actually. I was more focused in language education. And then I came across the term language rights. And of course, I did not immediately, actually, I came across the term language or linguistic justice, started looking more into it, and then I came across the organization that's called the Global Coalition for Language Rights. And I joined immediately because I was curious, and that's when I learned what language justice is. It's what you would think of as social justice with a focus on language, making sure that people, are able to access these services I mentioned in their language to be able to, it doesn't matter if it's, someone who has always lived in the same language context, but more specifically, I think the field of language rights and language justice kind of came up more in the context of where you find a lot of migrants coming into the country, like the US, like
Mhm.
Canada, parts of Europe. This is where you find a lot of human rights violations happening, language rights violations happening. I'll just give a couple of quick examples
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
current events. So, in the case of the US, for as long as we can remember, there was no official language. And then last year, it was declared that English is now the official language of the US. Before that, there was a legal obligation, perhaps not a legal obligation, but there was a sort of like sort of, I don't know if you want to call it civic duty on parts of various departments within the government and various companies out there, private and civil societies, to provide services, any of their services in Spanish, because a large part of the US population does speak Spanish and of course English as
Mhm.
well. There was sort of like a responsibility there to make services and products available in Spanish. But now that English is the official language, those violations, those language rights violations are happening even more because now um, there's no like responsibility, there's no obligation for any of these companies, these departments within the government to provide
Mhm.
any of these services that I mentioned before, education, healthcare, legal representation in these new migrants' language. And of course, funding recently got cut to all these services. So the little bit of funding and the little bit of language services that was provided before to
Mhm.
these individuals now is even less. There's even less of it. So that's one of the cases that you can see language rights violations taking place. The other situation is like with the invasion of Ukraine that's been going on for years now, or in the case of Gaza, people being forcibly displaced, and you find that when we tend to focus a lot on the physical wounds, like healing
Mhm.
the physical wounds in war. And people focus on surviving, and that's very natural. You want to focus on the immediate issue. But when you look deeper into what happens when someone is being displaced, when their country is being invaded, they're being forced out. And when they're being forced out, they lose the connection to their land, to their motherland, to their history, to their ancestors. They're losing their connection to their identity.
Mhm.
It's much more complex than just one looking at one identity, but various complex identities within the individual. They're losing their language, they're losing their culture. And in some cases, when you're being forced out of your country, you are losing your ability to even express yourself and having to learn a new language in the new place where you are. So it is natural that we focus a lot on
Mhm.
the physical wounds of war. And for some people, the what we might call language wounds, the mental wounds that comes from language loss, cultural loss, identity loss, and all that. For some people, it's not even something that comes up at all, right?
Mhm.
It's something that, over time, you might find yourself thinking, oh, yeah, I used to speak this language. Now I can't even do that in my current context. Or, oh, I used to have this cultural tradition and now I can't do that. Or my grandma used to tell me stories in my mother tongue. And now I don't even know how to pass that on to my children. So this comes up over time. It may not even come up. And all we're talking about here is um, trauma. And
Mhm.
this happens a lot and they are like the invisible wounds of war that
Mhm.
may come up over time or may not at all. So there's a big component of it that has to do with mental health as well. Hopefully we can talk about that later on, but I just wanted to bring it to the current context. Like, I'm sure lots of your listeners would be aware of what's happening in the US context and what's happening in the world in terms of the unnecessary wars that are taking place. I say unnecessary. I know there's a reason why they happen, but
Mhm.
in my opinion, from, let's say, my perspective as someone who is a language rights advocate, I see all these things that may not be so obvious
Mhm.
to most people, but from my perspective as a linguist, as a language justice advocate, I see these violations of human rights that are happening, but more specifically focus on language. So this is what I mean. This is what it means to me to be able to do this work, to be able to even talk about language rights as human rights and having platforms where we can educate people
Mhm.
about that. And this has been going on for me anyway. It's been a journey over the last 5 to 6 years. And for others, they've been talking about this for a long time, but mostly in academia. So being able to take this, outside of academia, outside of calling it linguistic rights, but calling it language rights and making that term even more accessible to various
Mhm.
communities out there, this is where you find me doing that sort of work in that context.
Thank you for that elaborate and deep response because the goal of potentiality is to make the invisible visible. And everything that you're speaking about is really bringing awareness around those invisible sides of language loss. Oftentimes, we don't view it as such. And I know being an immigrant and living in an immigrant community, there is a lot of push, especially working with parents, to help their children acquire the dominant language, and which is normal and there's a reason for that, especially for economic opportunities. But we oftentimes don't really pay attention to what is being lost in that exchange. And thank you for the examples that you brought. They're very much alive in the current times as we speak, and it affects all of us. But particularly, it affects those people who are being forced out of their land, and the immigrant communities in particular. I am a carrier of a heritage language, and I am fortunate to be, although I'm an immigrant, I'm fortunate to be in a community where this language is actually protected in many different ways, and it is encouraged. And I had the fortune of designing two language programs within school districts. But what I observe is through our life experience, especially those of us who carry indigenous languages, heritage languages, those that are not necessarily taking are given the attention that they deserve. Oftentimes, if they're not protected, then they slowly are lost from generation to generation. And I'm wondering if part of your experience growing up and the languages that you carry have shaped your professional path that you are walking so passionately with. Your passion comes through very clearly. So I'm wondering, Avishta, what was your own relationship with your own native language growing up? Was your native language protected, discouraged, or something in between? I see this a lot with the immigrant communities, and I'm just curious what your experience was and how it has impacted the professional path that you are on right now.
Right. So my language, so the very first language I heard was Mauritian Creole or Creole Mauricien. And but at the same time, I don't know if I would necessarily call it my mother tongue because I feel like English and French and Creole were all introduced to me at the same time. So for me, they're
Mm,
all sort of like my primary languages. So unfortunately, Mauritian Creole was and has always been associated until more in recent history to slavery.
mm,
So it was bad, and I didn't know this until I actually started going to school, that it was bad to speak Creole. So at home, I grew up with Mauritian Creole, while listening to the news in English and listening to the radio in French and Creole. But there was always, and then reading Les Fables de La Fontaine in French, the fables, but in French, and reading the fairy tales in English, and parents reading to us and all that. So learning for us was always, I guess, multilingual from the very beginning because I was
mm,
still watching my Bollywood movies, not reading the subtitles, not understanding yet what that all meant until I started learning Hindi in school. So my languages are, and the ones that I grew up with are Creole Mauricien, so Mauritian Creole, French, English, and Hindi.
mm,
So just to kind of give a brief overview of the system in Mauritius, like how it works. You grew up with these languages at home. If that is, if your parents are knowledgeable in these languages and can teach you some before you get to kindergarten. And then in kindergarten, you're introduced to English and French, but properly, where you actually study the language while you're still speaking Creole. And then at the primary level or elementary school in North America, you get introduced to Hindi. And what I mean by introduced is you actually get sort of like it gets forced onto you. So you can only imagine when something is being forced onto you, how much of it you
mm,
actually retain, right? Not a
mm,
whole lot. Um, so with Creole, what happened is as soon as I started going to school in Mauritius, we were being made fun of for speaking Creole. So the official languages in Mauritius are English and French. everything that you find in Mauritius is in French primarily.
Mm,
And then in English, in school you will hear English, and it's only in like in your English class and some of the most, I guess the medium of instruction in Mauritius is still, I think to this day, still in is English. But beyond that, your French class, your Hindi class, they're done in these languages. But for the
mhm,
most part, you don't hear Creole at all in school. In some public spaces you do, but as soon as you go to an office to go I don't know, to get some like legal services or something, or any sort of office like a notary or something, they only speak French, and they will look down on you if you speak Creole, because what it means to speak Creole even to this day in Mauritius is they associate that with being uneducated. So it doesn't matter if
mm,
you're a PhD holder, but if you walk anywhere in Mauritius and you don't speak French, the reality is that English, not everybody's comfortable with it. So you have to basically communicate in French. So if you speak Creole, even if you're a PhD holder, they will assume that you're uneducated and they will treat you poorly
mm,
just because you're using this language. So you can only imagine like learning this language and communicating with it in the first few years of your life. You go to school and now you're being treated badly, poorly because you're using the same language and other languages are being forced on you. And not in the same way, like the happy way that you were learning English and French in school, I mean in at home, but more like now you gotta do it because you need good grades. And we're very academically inclined in Mauritius, so we have to
mhm,
get good grades. Is not even an option. So for me, even though I didn't really care about Hindi, so jumping to Hindi now, because all of these are my languages, I had to get an A. So I work really hard. I always got my A. But if you ask me to say something in Hindi now, I can say some basic things, but I didn't retain much. I think I retained enough just to keep watching the Bollywood movies way back when, because when I moved to Canada, I couldn't just stop with the Bollywood movies and all that. But I can't. I resent it now because of the way that it was taught to me, and we were also punished. So in Mauritius, and I can't speak of how it is now. I left over 2 decades ago. But I was, smacked across the face for speaking Creole or for not getting an answer correct in like a Hindi class with a ruler in the hand or on your bum. So like we were actually punished when we didn't use the language we were supposed to, or when we were heard speaking Creole in school. And it doesn't help when your peers are, you know, making fun of you because you're not trying to speak French because everybody was supposed to speak French. English was taught and it's one of our official languages, but it's not needed to be well viewed in society. So that has been my relationship with my mother tongue, being told that, oh, you're not going to amount to anything if you keep using Creole. But guess what? And I do want to share this here. Things have changed. Now, while Creole is not a medium of instruction yet in Mauritius, it has been introduced as a course. First of all, it was only a spoken language when I left. So over the last 2 decades, people have worked really hard into having a standardized writing system for Creole, which is a major move, positive towards in a good, let's say, good direction. And it has also been introduced at least up until I think the secondary level, no, the primary level as a subject. And you can even learn it in university now. So we're moving in the right direction,
mhm,
but hopefully it can come to the point where it's also a medium of instruction. And while I don't necessarily advocate directly because this is not my personal context anymore, I do support that sort of movement, even if I don't find myself speaking Creole as much as before. I do speak it still. I do want your listeners to know that, even though I left my, country a long, long time ago. My parents and I, we communicate in Creole for the most part, and my siblings and I, we also communicate in Creole. So that has been my, let's say, my entire, 30 plus years of my relationship with all the languages. And I'm happy to say that I never stopped learning languages. I speak Spanish fluently to now beyond English, Creole, and French.
It's amazing. And thank you for sharing your story and actually acknowledging the fact that we are moving in the right direction. I think there are a lot of efforts now being made to protect, particularly the more endangered languages, the heritage languages, indigenous languages, and those efforts are starting to pay off. Language is so much more than means of communication, as you already alluded several times in your responses, Avishta. It goes layers and layers deep. It's part of our identity. It impacts our mental health. It impacts our economic access, and so much more. We will be hopefully unpacking all of those today. You mentioned language wounds in your first response, and I want to go back to it. So please help us understand what are language wounds, and there can be many, as you already shared in some examples, through displacement, war, or even not having basic access to it, particularly in migrant communities. But if we speak in the inter kind of generational term, across generations, what are language wounds and how do they form?
Um, so language wounds are the psychological damage that you face, and maybe even cultural damage that you face when your language and everything that comes with it, that's deeply inherent in you as an individual, is ridiculed, like in what I just shared about my own language, right? When it's suppressed, when it is removed in certain contexts. So language wounds are this like this type of damage that you feel that may not be so obvious. Like it may not be, it's not like a physical one that you can see it and you know you need to fix it right away. It's something that can come up over time. It can come up in your lifetime. It might come up in other generations, actually. So what it means for different generations is I can't speak to like let's say the deeply biological aspect of it, but I can say like for example with indigenous communities here, even in the Canadian context, they talk a lot about intergenerational trauma, and a big part of this is what the older generations of indigenous communities here, they were uh, put in residential schools where they
Mhm.
were basically stripped away of their identity, their cultural, linguistic, any like all of their identities, their way of when they were stripped of their language to be sort of like re-educated into, the new system. They it caused a sort of like fracture to their
Mhm.
core that in their connection to, and this is something that they're trying to reclaim now, and some of these communities do really well, but being able to connect to their ancestors, which is a really big part of their identity, as native to the land, their connection to the land, the connection to their ancestors, and to their language as well, and being able to not just communicate, but being able to, there are certain there are certain things that just cannot be translated from one language to another.
Mhm.
So when
Mhm.
you are stripping someone of their language, you're stripping their ability to even be able to think,
Mhm.
and re-educating them completely, especially adults, because that happened to adults too, is not something that is natural, is not something that is easily digested within the individual. And unfortunately, that trauma that stays within the person gets passed on to future generations. Now, I can't speak to the biological aspect of it, but
Mhm.
it is now while it might not be seen directly into encoded into the DNA itself, but it is something that does get passed on, that is inherited, unfortunately, from the younger generation. Even stress is something that I've been doing some research into because of my work with trauma and mental health. I've seen like how stress can even be passed on from the mom if the mom is a stressed
Mhm.
individual. in the womb when she's carrying the baby in the womb can pass on that stress to the baby. So if it's stress that was already within the mom, it gets passed on to the baby. And if that
Mhm.
stress was trauma experience from you having your identity, your language, your culture, your connection to everything being stripped away, there might be one of the consequences, unfortunately, is that this also gets passed on to the future generations. And learned behavior is a part of it too. If you, for example, you had your language be stripped away, you're not likely going to pass it on because of all the trauma you faced with that. You're not likely going to pass it on to your child. And that sort of trauma then also gets passed on because your frustration, the stress, the anxiety you felt with your language that was unfortunately forced onto you to feel this way, you pass that sort of like frustration onto your child. So I believe this is what, when in terms of language wounds, in terms of like that sort of like yeah, in terms of the language ones, this is what you might see being passed on, unfortunately, into like to the younger generations. And if you never learn to reclaim that language, then you can't support your child to do that. Your child, then when they have children, it just gets passed on if it's never addressed. And for the most part, it is never addressed,
Mhm.
unfortunately. Because again, we
Mhm.
focused on the physical ones much more than we focus on the mental, which a part of the mental wound is the language wound. So that I think this is sort of like what I have seen and what a lot of people in this space, not necessarily language rights space, but lots of people who work in language revitalization, language documentation, this is what they experience when they work with indigenous communities and they see that some people are even reluctant to talk about, not even in their language, even if they can't do it anymore, talk about their language itself because it's so painful, right? To
Mhm.
talk about it. So anyway, yeah, so that's what I think about, the intergenerational trauma that indigenous communities, and also to be honest, we talk a lot about indigenous communities, but I also talk about Creole communities. Indigenous languages within the bigger sphere of underrepresented languages exist indigenous languages, but we also have Creole languages, which one of the most popular ones, most commonly known ones is the Haitian Creole. Usually when I use Haitian Creole as a reference, people start understanding what I mean by Creole. So, and I mentioned my language also, Mauritian Creole. There are many of them where they have been treated the same way as indigenous languages, but they don't necessarily get the same attention as indigenous languages. So one of the things that I've been wanting to do, and hopefully I have tried to do, is trying to bring in Creole languages also in the conversation as part of being underrepresented and not only, and I'm saying this is because it is relevant in terms of the intergenerational trauma. And when we're talking about language wounds, it doesn't just happen within indigenous communities. It does happen in my own community in Mauritius, where what I have I'm starting I've started my healing process with my language, but I can't say the same thing for my parents, for example, or for other people who don't necessarily work in my field. So they haven't even begin to think about what happened when they were younger and they were told they were being ridiculed and their language was suppressed. So this is like hopefully with me, and if I happen to have children, then my I guess my approach would be a little bit different from what my parents, the way that, they never told us, hey, this is bad. But they also never told
Mhm.
us that when you were being ridiculed, that actually, when you're being ridiculed, you don't necessarily tell your parents about that, right?
Mhm.
It's because there's shame. You feel
Of
ashamed
course.
about your language. So anyway, hopefully, being able to talk about this now and with your listeners too, they know that, you can start the healing process when it comes to your language wounds. You don't have to wait, and there's many ways you can do that to reclaim your language, whether it's heritage or your mother tongue that you may have lost a long time ago.
Mhm. And I want us to talk about ways to reclaim and healing of the language wounds because it's so important. And I think, particularly now, being in the mental health crisis, particularly among youth, it's really the age group that I work with. I think oftentimes we pay attention to what's at the surface, and it's all valid. The technology, the fast pace, and everything else that impacts their psychological well being, but sometimes it gets lost or not even the awareness is not there that the fracture at the core of your identity, which is what language loss causes, may not be one of the biggest contributors to their mental health. And something that I want us to bring awareness around and give some practical ways for people to reclaim their language or start that healing process with language wounds, just like everything else you so beautifully spoke about, epigenetic inheritance.
Mhm.
Everything that we experience is epigenetically, if not genetically, it's epigenetically passed down to the next generation. And language is one of those. Language creates our worldview, it shapes our thinking, and it really shapes our identity. It is how our ancestral wisdom is passed down to us, and as well as the trauma, right? So we really want to be fully aware of how much language carries within it, the actual encoding of it, which is way beyond just the means of communication. And so, what happens when it's minimized, corrected, replaced, ridiculed, as you mentioned? I am actually in the process of preparing series of workshops for one of the largest school districts in the country. And one of the workshops is actually focusing on shame around language. And oftentimes we don't really look at the physiological component of language acquisition, fully focusing on the cognitive side of things. But if we carry those language wounds and they've never really been healed, so what does it really mean if I am carrying the weight of my language being ridiculed through, over the generations, but now I have access to it? How do I view it? Do I really take opportunity to take the language, or that still lives within me as something that I do not want to access at all? And then the actual physiological side of it, when we are in stress around our identity in general, then the prefrontal lobe just basically shuts down and language acquisition is not available to us, just like any other cognitive skill development. And so those are the things that I'm trying to bring more awareness around. So what happens if your students are experiencing shame around their native language? Like, and what is the role of the teacher in changing that beyond academic instruction? So thank you for speaking so beautifully to all those deeper layers of language and what it means to live in a language. So let's give some examples, Avishta. And this is beautiful. I want to know your own story and your own efforts. What is it that you are doing to heal the language wounds? How can language be reclaimed? And what is something practical that maybe our audience can do for themselves if they find that they have lost the language that they spoke for generations, or they're speaking it, but their children no longer are, and that would be, uh, relevant to me as well.
Um, so one of the things that I still do to this day to connect to my language is I go because unfortunately I lost my last grandparent couple of years ago. So I really like listening to stories.
Mm.
I try to go back to my parents and ask them about their stories. And my parents still speak, fluently that version of the Creole language that we used to speak when we left the country because language has evolved. So I go back to them and I ask them to tell me stories about their childhood, tell me stories that have been passed on to them. And I think one of the best ways that you can sort of start the journey of reclaiming your language, learning about your language is through storytelling. And now not all of us have the privilege of going to a direct like parent or grandparent,
Mhm.
but we are so connected nowadays that I think you can always try to find and language communities are huge. You can always find, even if you don't have a family member who speaks the language, find someone who is talking about your language, your heritage language. If you wanted to learn, and you can start by learning a few words in the language and go from there. I think that's one of the things that you can do. I'll go back to storytelling again. I just absolutely love storytelling because you're learning something, and most people are just really hungry for knowledge nowadays.
Mhm.
You're learning about your ancestors, you're learning about your family history, which some parents sometimes pass this on to their kids and some don't. So going back as much as you can through your own lineage to family members to ask, obviously to tell the stories in the language. But it all depends on where you are with your language. A lot of people can understand it, but they may not be able to speak it. So that's where storytelling, I think, comes in and can really help. Um, Another way is I think for the teachers, you mentioned the teachers too. I think it's one of my sort of like turning points when it comes to language education happened a few years ago when I took a neuro language coaching class. And I started realizing that not only was I taught languages wrong, but I was also doing it wrong. There was such a like a much better way out there to for me to talk about language and to teach language to other people because I did teach English for a few years. And I started realizing that, our perspective of like how we teach language is like our approach is wrong. We need to come in from the angle of how do we take and I know this is hard in a classroom of 30 kids. How do you
Mhm.
take the child's own like living experience, what they like to do, and bring in language to that? How do you connect, this like the child to like and to language, but to a sense of belonging, which is
Mhm.
what I was never taught. Because language is about that, is a way to connect with others, it is about belonging. So when I realized that a long time ago, I changed my approach to language education, like to teaching language completely. So I would say, like, as when you can, at least the freelance language educators out there, when you are working one-on-one, don't impose on the person when you're learning the language. Obviously, understand where the person is at with the language, right? But work with what they enjoy doing, right?
Mhm.
So if you have a bunch of the children in school that enjoys through games, which is very much a thing nowadays, right? Learning,
Mhm.
even you can learn language through games. I'm not
Mhm.
just talking about Duolingo. There are other apps out there that you can learn a new language or your heritage language through different types of games. So flexibility and adaptability within the language teacher is what I think language teaching demands. And unfortunately, maybe up until recently, most language teachers were not trained that way. So it is a matter of a sort of personal journey that you have to find within yourself as a language teacher to take on this sort of like training to understand
Mhm.
how do you bring in the child's lived experience, their personal experience into their learning so that they can really connect the language to a sense of like who they are. I know at some other time we talked about like DNA, the connection between language and DNA. If there was a
Mhm.
way where language teachers could learn about that, imagine like how language learning would be so fun and so important, right? Unfortunately, we're not at that point where everybody will go out there and like learn how to be a better language teachers. So I think what I would say to language teachers nowadays is if you're still teaching language from like a grammar and vocabulary point of view, then maybe I don't want to sound like I don't want this to come off the wrong way, but at least go out there and educate yourself on new ways of like what other people are doing and find your own path to supporting your learners. So that is what I would say. And while also recognizing that the language that the child is bringing, to the classroom is equally as important as the language that you're teaching or the whatever you're teaching in the other language. And for parents themselves, because there's two things here. How do parents try to reconnect with their language and how do they teach it to their children, right? There's those two things here.
Mhm.
Um, For me, the most beautiful thing is what I'm learning now with game design is finding fun little games that you can create or finding frameworks out there that already exist to make the learning process fun. Everybody, adults, adolescents, kids, everybody's learning through games nowadays. So my I guess suggestion here would be looking at ways to do it through games. Um, and even in like fun little things that you can do if you've been playing a game forever, but in English, switch it up a little bit. If there's a possibility of playing the game in like, I don't know, another language like Spanish, put it in Spanish, and that way you're doing something fun. You're like playing a game that you enjoy doing already, but now you're doing it in another language. You're learning in the process, even if it's passively, you are learning in the process. So things like that, like fun ways, things that I was never taught to learn a language in, but while playing a game, it was always memorization, right? And forcing you into learning things that you don't really and not even like focusing on how this would be useful because nowadays people are pushing dominant languages on younger generations and saying like, oh, this will lead to career opportunities, to economic opportunities, but not so much, the your mother tongue. What is that?
Mhm.
What is that good for? We can get into the neuroscience side of things. I don't think we have enough time for that, but you and I both know that a bilingual and a multilingual brain or trilingual brain is in many ways a happier, more
Mhm.
active brain than a monolingual one. So that's another thing for parents to think about too, the cognitive benefits. Even just knowing that as a new parent, you might think about, oh, well, if this is going to benefit my child in the long run, why not try to,
Mhm.
even instill some level of any language that you want in them from a beginning, and then let them decide later on if they want to pursue it or not.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's kind of like where that has been my personal experience with and things that I have done myself.
Thank you for those beautiful examples. I find them to be very practical, especially reclaiming language through storytelling. And it's not only the language, but the wisdom that lives within the language, and also gamifying. I mean, that's the natural way we learn. We learn through play. So sometimes, learning through game design might get a bad rap, but it's actually a very human way to learn. So we really want to bring play into language learning. Thank you for speaking to the belonging aspect of things. One of the things that I try to teach to language educators is the neuroscience of belonging. There's this actual very measurable scientific field that we can explore. And I think the educators, particularly language educators and multilingual environments, need to be very well aware of. And more than anything, what is the role of their own regulatory capacity in creating that classroom of belonging for multilingual learners? I am developing a linguistic identity protocol as one of the workshops where the students will be able to bring their entire linguistic heritage, not only the languages that they speak or they're learning or they would like to learn, right? It's all part of their identity. Everything is alive with them, even if they're not speaking it yet, as well as what their parents carried, their grandparents, and it could be different dialects, it could be different levels of proficiency. I think in the academic setting, we oftentimes focus so much on the output that we sometimes forget to bring the lived experience of lineage within the language is really, really important. Thank you so much for those very elaborate and detailed answers, Avishta. I find in my experience working in migrant communities that many families don't truly choose to move away from their native language. It really happens through life experience. And I really want to unpack the next question with you because I know this is something that you explore deeply, and this is language as infrastructure, right? So if the language was viewed as infrastructure, the same way as, let's say, the highways and electricity, if we really viewed it that way, what would shift? What would become available to us?
Um, if we treat it language as the same way as, let's say, the need for water as part of,
Mm-hmm.
like, if you need water, you build pipes, right?
Mm-hmm.
As like building the infrastructure for the basic need of having water. Um, it would it would actually guarantee a lot of things that creates a lot of inequalities in society today. Because the fact that language is what connects us all. So what I mean by that is it would potentially, maybe not guarantee, but it would improve participation of people in society. Whether it's civic participation, you would see more people getting access to more those basic essential services that I talked about before, like education, like mental health as well. Mental
Mm-hmm.
health is
Mm-hmm.
a big one for me now. We still don't, in many languages, like in many communities out there, we still don't know how to talk, how to address mental health. And in many languages, there aren't terms that exist to even be able to talk about mental health in the way, like you have, instead of talking about mental health, you may need to say well-being. You
Mm-hmm.
are talking about mental health, but you have to choose other languages. So if we actually looked at language as infrastructure, we would um, we would have access to multilingual public services where if the government is investing in um, um, like quality language services, it would guarantee that your education may not just be in the dominant language in the country, it could actually be in your mother tongue. So
Mm-hmm.
it would promote mother tongue based education because language is already is the foundation, right, of being able to teach anything at school. So if money was put towards language as the infrastructure for education,
Mm-hmm.
then people wouldn't have to learn other languages to have access to education, to any sort of quality education. They would be getting an education in their language. You would have all these essential services in your language, in multiple languages. So that would actually reduce inequality in society. Um, Nowadays, we find ourselves a lot on what I do this because it's online, the internet.
Mm-hmm.
We're online, right? We're connected. Um, so in another part of my work is digital inclusion. It goes hand in hand with language rights, digital justice. They go hand in hand because nowadays, for example, we've been talking about preserving languages for a long time, but now because our lives are more online than,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, person nowadays. If we're communicating, connecting with people online, and you can't do that in your language, then are your rights the same as the other person who has their language that's fully active online, right?
Mm-hmm.
So digital, like you actually increase digital participation as well and representation of people in the online community in these underrepresented languages. Um, so yeah, so there are all these like angles. Like if you were to look at language as infrastructure, the bigger way of looking at it here is the systems themselves would be designed to adapt to people and not for
Mm-hmm.
people to adapt to them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if we were to think about language that way, and I actually, let me just quickly, this is kind of a side note, but I recently posted about that on LinkedIn. I saw somebody else's post about the fact that language as a sector, we never get direct funding. If you have
Mm-hmm.
a language focused program that you're running, you always have to associate it to something else to get some sort of funding, either it's climate or AI nowadays, or um, I don't know, education, mental health. you need to partner up with somebody else to be able to get some sort of minimal funding for your language related um, program. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is because if language was seen as infrastructure, like education is, like school is for education,
Mhm.
then you wouldn't think twice before giving funding to a language. You would just do that. You wouldn't say, hey, well, language is just language. It's like an add-on. It's like a cultural add-on to something, right? It's viewing it as the core of everything, right? So I think if we were to treat language as infrastructure, we would see a lot less inequalities. Like what I'm trying to say here, the bigger picture is a lot less inequality. People would have more access to a lot of things, essential public services, and that would reduce inequalities in society when it comes to education, healthcare, legal representation, just access in general. That's what I mean by that.
That is a very interesting fact that there is no direct funding for languages, and you really have to find all those loopholes and tie it to something else. And I'm curious, why is that is the case? Why do you think languages are not funded? Or do you have any information around that?
I feel like I'm a kind of a novice when it comes to the
Okay.
field of language. I wouldn't be able to pinpoint anything out directly, but I think it's because there's tons, like the systems were not built
Mm,
looking at bilingual or trilingual, multilingual individuals in mind, or people who speak non-dominant languages. I
mm,
think this is the main reason why. Systems have not been built to think of what they might unfortunately call in the US the other.
mm,
So I believe if I were to pinpoint one thing, it's that the systems have been built in a way that is very exclusive and not at all
mm,
inclusive. So even when it comes to grants, getting funding for something, language is not something that they necessarily think about because it's also not seen as essential, which
mm,
you and I both know that it is, right?
mm,
There's nothing that you can do, no healthcare, no education, no access to anything without language. But it's not viewed as such because then you might actually need to provide services in different languages, which would
mm,
cost more money, right?
mm,
So I think it's a way to keep various underrepresented communities down.
mm,
It's intentional, those
mm.
systems, who built them and how they were built and who they were built for. Um, I think that's all I can say. I can't break it down further. Unfortunately, I don't know
No,
enough.
I think that is sufficient because we really want to speak to the fact that there is intentionality behind it. Sometimes it's just the distribution of resources that is not done well, but oftentimes it is by design. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. Avishta, I want to ask you a little bit to elaborate on your work around game design within the language space, as well as digital inclusion. We are in a new era with everything, with AI disrupting pretty much all fields of human activity. And I'm really curious, you being on the leading edge of all the changes happening within the language space, what exactly does it look like? What are your most recent projects that I know you're very passionate about?
Sure. Um, so there's one of them I can definitely talk about, and the other one is still in development.
Okay.
So I'll start with digital inclusion. So, with African Languages Conference, we recently launched a program called the Digital Futures Incubator, where we have recruited about 100 individuals from representing over 20 African languages, including a couple of Creole ones, but mostly indigenous languages across Africa. And what we're trying to do here is to advance the presence of these African languages online. So primarily what these individuals are doing, this is like a 5-week cohort, and primarily what they're doing is validating data. So building before I go too much into it, what we're doing is building the foundation that
Mhm.
is necessary to bring languages from um, the everyday like spoken context into the digital world. So building the foundation of that. Basically digitizing the language, the initial phases of digitizing the language. So this is what this program has been focused on. We are this is like a brand new a brand new endeavor for African Languages Conference, as we've purely been focused on you know, organizing spaces, conferences where people can talk about African languages in African languages, which is was um, a new idea, something that wasn't that had not been done before. And then I personally, yeah, started moving more towards, looking at this angle of preserving languages, but we can't really do that if we're not looking at how languages um, um, are being seen, let's say, and
Mhm. Mhm.
accessed in the digital sphere. And so I saw this opportunity. We partnered up with Silicon at Stanford University over the last couple of years. And then this year we decided to take our relationship, to the next level and dig deeper into the relationship between
Mhm.
language rights, and also digital inclusion. So we launched this project earlier this year, immediately after our annual conference, and we've been working on that. And as I said, it's there's two cohorts this summer. We launch next, actually later this month, and these individuals, they'll be basically what they'll be doing is helping supporting their language, taking it ideally to the next level. So within when you digitize a language, there are various levels that the language can find itself, like basic and intermediate, or modern or advanced. And so different
Mhm.
levels. And except for English and maybe Spanish and maybe some other dominant languages, most of them, they find themselves in these different categories, right? Obviously,
Mhm.
English would be the most digitized version, like the most modern.
Mhm.
So this is what we've been doing for African languages specifically. I'm hoping that at some point, because my focus is on Latin America and Africa, that I can actually take this work and work with Latin American communities as well
Mhm.
later on. So this is one thing. The other project, which I'm hoping will be through African Languages Conference too, is has to do with digital inclusion as well, and within the African context too. But it is not a language digitization initiative. Um,
Mhm.
and I can't say a lot more than that because it's still in development. But let's just say that we will be helping vulnerable communities and in being included in the digital, let's say, revolution that's going on across Africa as well. And then with the game design, there's a couple of really cool projects that I've had the opportunity to be a part of. I'm still learning about game design, by the way. I'm fortunate enough to be working with my colleagues who, one of them has been working in game design for over 30 years. And he's also
Mhm.
a LARPer, so live action role-playing games. He's short for LARP. So he's a LARPer, and actually both of them are LARPers. And the other one who introduced me to this world of transformative game design, they brought me on into a project last year, and this project was actually developed because we wanted to support. I mentioned Gaza earlier,
Mhm.
with it, we wanted to do something to support the communities in Gaza, and especially the displaced communities.
Mhm.
And we didn't really know what to do. And then one of my colleagues came up, with this. The both of them, they were designing this program that would address mental health and trauma through live action role-playing games. So they designed this framework called the program itself is called GRIT, short for Games for Resilience and Interactive Transformation.
Mm.
And they designed this framework as part of the grid program where basically you design an adventure, a game, and you invite people. This is in person, by the way. This is not a digital game. This is an
Mhm.
in-person game, which promotes social cohesion, a sense of belonging as well to a new community. So you become a part of this game where the characters and the adventure itself is actually designed to tackle any sort of like crisis that you might have found yourself with. And
Mm.
so within the Gaza situation, what we wanted to tackle was the wounds of war, right? Helping people with being able to talk about what's been happening, in their country and what has happened to them as individuals. And so when I was brought on into this project, it was more to learn about game design, and I started, I couldn't help but bring my cultural and linguistic lens and
Mhm.
my like co-creation, like me and like the team, all of us decided, co-creating with the community is what we want to do because the idea
Mhm.
with this framework, with this, game is to bring in members of the community themselves to co-design these
Mhm.
adventures, these games with us.
Mhm.
Because we are foreigners, we are strangers going into other people's communities, and they have their lived experience, which we need to bring into the story. But
Mhm.
we can't do that on our own, right? So this co-creation angle was really important to bring communities into so that they can bring their stories into the game. So now when you're bringing people's stories, this is culture, right?
Mhm.
So within that, and this is where the cultural and linguistic lens comes in, because we are tackling cultural loss, we are tackling identity loss, we are tackling language loss. The idea is to co-create with the communities and then make the program, the game itself, accessible in the language of the community. So first of all, the framework itself has been designed in English because we're all English
Mhm.
speakers. But the beauty of it is that we don't run the program. We go to train people to run their own program with their own communities. So this is like that's where I sort of like shine within the teams, thinking of like how do we tackle, yes, we want to talk about mental health. Obviously, this is like the main objective,
Mhm.
supporting people who have found themselves in crisis, so in post-crisis situations. Like so post-crisis is when we actually work with them. But the crisis is not just mental health, right? It's not just the mental health that's being affected. There's a deep sense of loss, of
Mhm.
belonging, of all of the things we've been talking about, language, culture, and identity, connection to land, connection to your ancestors, connection to your people, to your history. So all of that can be tackled when you are designing this game. And the big part of it is actually being done through cultural storytelling.
Mhm.
So at the end of it, and this is the last thing, because I can talk about this for a long time. The last thing I'll say is that the beauty of all of this is that when we are designing these games, this is not just a one-time thing. It happens over a period of time. So the way we've designed it is that within a year, we can actually, if it's done the way it's been designed, we can actually support about 1,000 people, adults, children, and teenagers within a year.
Mhm.
Each we have about 4 cycles that we can run in a year, and each cycle is run for about 12 to 13 sessions. So these individuals who participate in the program, they're being immersed not just for one time, but actually over a period of about 3 months. So what comes out of it, and it's not just the one game, right? It's several games that are being designed within the one cycle.
Mhm.
So what happens is that what we are indirectly doing, but unintentionally, but now we know about it, intentionally doing, is we are creating cultural assets. We are documenting the language, we are documenting the culture through the storytelling. And the fact that the entire experience happens in your language is a benefit to making sure that the language is actually being passed on, even though you don't find yourself in your country anymore because you're part of the displaced community. So this is like by far I think the one program that I've been a part of that I've been the most proud of. Me and the entire team, we talk about this all the time, like how we've designed something that is, if it's truly like implemented, properly implemented, it can be used, this type of framework can be used for so many different crisis and non-crisis situations,
Mhm.
not just for cultural bridge building. It can be used in education. We've actually been looking at the opportunity of bringing this into STEM education
Mhm.
um, in Colombia, actually. So it goes what we've designed with grit. It's something truly. Honestly, like even as I'm talking about it right now, I feel so proud that I'm a part of this, knowing nothing about game design. I'm a part of it, but also the fact that, and I will say this because this is an example of looking at language
Mhm.
as part of the infrastructure because it is part of the design itself of this program. So this is a good example of what I mean by language as part of the design as the infrastructure as the foundation of anything that you build, any sort of program
Mhm.
or system.
That is a great example of language as an infrastructure, and it's a fascinating project. I was listening to you and really paying attention to the intentionality, the precision, the level of awareness that you're bringing with your team into this project. And through cultural, you're bringing their voices, their cultural lived experience into co-design, like you said, which is a really critical element. And I think moving forward, it will be for any project because the times of we are designing and then we're selling it to you are long gone. It really needs to be attuned, very finely tuned to those who will be using the products or the services. So, and I was also thinking of the scalability of it. This is not only for displaced communities. I'm thinking of my own language as I'm listening to you, that how much it would benefit, particularly most of it, the population of the country is 1/3 of the diaspora that lives abroad. So having a project like this to serve their needs, to pass down their cultural and linguistic heritage is invaluable. So thank you for sharing. And I feel like this conversation could go on for hours because language is such a deep topic and there's so many angles and layers to it. But to wrap up our conversation, Avishta, I want to ask you our last traditional potentiality question. You mentioned already the push towards dominant languages, and it is more alive, I think, in the times of exponential technologies, because most of that content is available through English only because it is created and designed in English. And to kind of counterbalance that, I want to ask you the potentiality question. What becomes possible for humanity when every person is able to exist, think, learn, and express themselves in the language that holds their deepest truth?
Ooh. Um, I think expansion of human intelligence, maybe.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, yeah, I don't really know how to answer that. I think why wouldn't be possible
Mhm.
if we were able to really do everything in the language that we're most comfortable with and not have to force ourselves to learn English, to be able to really access our truest potential. If we were able to do that in our language,
Mhm.
I don't know. I think it would be like as a like the human species, we would be far beyond as to what we are, where we are now.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, yeah, it's such a complex question.
It is a
Um,
big question, but I think your initial instinct probably says it all. And I personally trusted the most when you said it's the expansion of human intelligence, because the language that represents our deepest truth carries our deepest intelligence. So if we're able to excavate it and bring forth and actually share it with the world, that's when we can make our biggest contribution, like really give the intelligence that lives within us and has been passed down through generations within the language and the culture, and make that available to the world. Even if it's to your smallest community, it is still really bringing that intelligence and sharing it where maybe it was not available before.
Let me put it this way. I think if that was the case, then all these like big questions that we're still trying to find the answers for, like climate change, how do we tackle global warming?
Mhm.
Um, Everybody's so scared of AI nowadays. Maybe we wouldn't be so scared of AI. Um, Maybe we would be far like in terms of like if let's say if everyone was able to access knowledge in their own language, we would have potentially answers to questions like cancer. Like we would have people would have cancers, but we would have a cure for it potentially, right? Because there's so much knowledge that can be accessed in certain languages and not others. It
Mhm.
would like if we could find a way to really learn from each other through language,
Mhm.
then there well, there's so many things that are coming
Mhm.
to my mind right now, but I'll just say this. We know that indigenous communities have bring in the knowledge, whether it's part of their DNA,
Mhm.
their connection to their ancestors is very, very deep, and the knowledge is also very deep. There are things that comes naturally to some people, even though they didn't learn it. They just it's like it's
Mhm.
almost like instinct.
Mhm.
We, as in the in a Western society, we don't know how to do that. There's a huge potential for us to learn, and they are using other languages, they're using other traditions and practices to be able to tap into that sort of knowledge.
Mhm.
When we like, I mean, like the Western society might think of this as ridiculous, right?
Mhm.
Because we don't think that way. We are thinking very futurist thinkers here, right?
Mhm.
Where
And even with that futuristic thinking, sorry to interrupt, I feel like it's really the access to the deepest intelligence that helps us create a better future. Like you said, a lot of things that we're still trying to tackle, problems that we can solve, maybe the answer really lives that intelligence that gets lost with the loss of a language. That's the question that I'm asking. What intelligence is being lost with the loss of a language in any generation, and even with one particular human? Because all of the inventions were made by just one, right? And so if we're thinking about the lineage, the culture, the tribe, the nation, whatever we think, if that intelligence was carried through the language and culture into this one individual who lost it, what intelligence got lost with it that is now no longer accessible to humanity, which could potentially solve one of those big problems.
hmm Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, if only.
If
Maybe this is
only.
the direction, yeah, maybe this is the direction where we're going. And having conversations like this, you don't know who might be listening and be like, "Oh my God, I have the solution. I know what we need to do." So hopefully it can spark curiosity for people to
Mhm.
even just look at language in a different way. I think that has been a part of my mission since I started working is trying to talk about language and how it's actually in everything that we do, as in is not its own, yes, it is its own sector, its own world, but beyond that, we are constantly surrounded by language. We use it in everything. It's in us. And I don't want people, part of my mission, personal mission, is to show people that it's more than just about communicating. It's not, I was introduced to language as a communication tool, but we both know that is way, way beyond that. It's much more complex than we can explain in this episode for today. But it's been wonderful to like dig deeper into my own thinking about language. I love the way you framed everything. So thank you. yeah, for the
Thank you
opportunity.
so much for sharing this space with me, for the richness of lived experience that you brought into this space, into this exploration. I would love to continue this conversation with you. There's so many unanswered questions that are still living in my head from different angles that we could approach. And I think, just like you said, if it sparks somebody's curiosity, it creates that aha moment for somebody. You don't know if they act on it, what they will be able to create for the world. So role, my mission is to bring that awareness and ask these big questions and see where it lands, with whom it lands, and what is possibly going to sprout from there. I want to thank you again for being here with me. If our audience wants to learn more about the work that you do, maybe connect with you, invite you to another insightful dialogue like this, where can they find you?
The best place to find me is on LinkedIn. It's just if you Google my name in LinkedIn, you'll find me, Avishta Seeras. I in the process of creating my own website and everything, but all of my work and everything that I do, I usually post on LinkedIn, so that's where everyone can find me.
Thank you so much once again, Avishta. It was a true pleasure and honor going into this exploration with you. And I look forward to having more dialogues around different aspects of language loss and language reclamation, language learning, and hopefully we can take on a different trajectory of excavating that deep intelligence that lives within different languages and cultures and bringing those into the world.
Thank you so much, Alina, for the opportunity to talk about why I do what I do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being with us today. I am grateful for each one of you tuning into today's episode, and I sincerely hope you found it insightful and valuable. Please remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet to never miss an episode. I will see you next time.